A Filipino fisherman discovered a platform on stilts and a Chinese flag flying over Mischief Reef from the Philippine shores within Manila's exclusive economic zone.
Every day, thousands of ships quietly pass through the South China Sea. Oil tankers, container ships, bulk carriers, the arteries of global trade. Economists estimate that more than $3.4 trillion worth of commerce moves through these waters every single year, linking factories in East Asia with markets in Europe and energy suppliers in the Middle East. It's one of those places most people rarely think about, yet the global economy would stumble without it. Now imagine this. You're sailing through these open waters and suddenly a question hits you. What if a small reef, barely visible above the sea a few decades ago, quietly turned into a military outpost that could monitor, even influence, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth? That's exactly the story of Mischief Reef. Today, satellite images show long runways, fortified structures, radar systems, and deep water facilities where fishermen once anchored their boats. But the transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly at first. A handful of structures here, a patrol there, a construction project that grew larger year by year. By the time the world fully realized what was happening, the reef had effectively become a strategic stronghold for China. And here's the twist that makes the situation even more complicated. Mischief Reef sits well within the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone claimed by the Philippines under the rules of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. In legal terms, that should give Manila certain sovereign rights over the area's resources and activities. But in reality, control on the water often depends less on legal arguments and more on ships, infrastructure, and power projection. That's why the reef has become such a sensitive flashpoint. It sits inside the wider Spratly Islands, a scattered chain of reefs, shoals, and tiny islands claimed by several governments including China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei. For decades, these claims simmered in diplomatic statements and occasional patrol encounters. But as energy resources, fisheries, and strategic sea lanes gained importance, the competition intensified. China's claim, marked by the controversial 9-line, stretches across much of the South China Sea and overlaps with the maritime zones of several Southeast Asian states. Critics argue that the claim contradicts modern maritime law, while Beijing insists it reflects historical rights. And right in the middle of this legal and geopolitical storm sits Mischief Reef, a location that has become a symbol of how territorial disputes in the South China Sea are no longer just about maps. They're about control on the ground, or more accurately, control on the water. So the real question isn't just how China built its presence there. The deeper question is this: can the Philippines actually do anything about it now? This analysis explores how China gradually consolidated its hold over Mischief Reef, examines the Philippines' legal, diplomatic, and strategic responses, and ultimately asks whether Manila has any realistic pathway to challenge Beijing's control, or whether the balance of power in this part of the South China Sea has already shifted for good. If you look at a map of the South China Sea, Mischief Reef doesn't look dramatic. It's not a towering island or a chain of cliffs. In fact, for most of its natural history, it was barely visible at all. The reef sits roughly 125 nautical miles west of Palawan, the long Philippine island that stretches toward the heart of the South China Sea. That distance matters, because it places Mischief Reef well inside the maritime zone claimed by the Philippines under international law. Here's the technical detail that makes the dispute even more interesting. Naturally, Mischief Reef is what legal experts call a low tide elevation. In simple terms, it's a feature that is submerged when the tide is high and only partially visible when the tide drops. Under the rules of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, such features cannot generate their own territorial waters or exclusive economic zones. That means the reef, on its own, doesn't legally extend sovereignty outward. Its status depends entirely on whose maritime zone it lies within, and geographically, that zone belongs to the Philippines. But the legal definition tells only part of the story. What matters just as much is what sits around the reef. For generations, fishermen from coastal communities in Palawan have sailed into these waters. The sea around Mischief Reef is rich with marine life, tuna, mackerel, reef fish, the kind of catch that sustains local markets and dinner tables across the Philippines. In many coastal villages, seafood isn't just a livelihood, it's a daily staple. Control over fishing grounds like these directly affects food security for thousands of families. Then there's the energy factor. The broader waters of what the Philippines calls the West Philippine Sea are believed to hold enormous energy potential, billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of natural gas beneath the seabed. For a country that still relies heavily on imported fuel, access to these resources represents more than economic opportunity. It's about long-term energy independence. But perhaps the biggest strategic factor is geography. The South China Sea functions like a maritime highway connecting Northeast Asia to global markets. Tankers carrying Middle Eastern oil to Japan and South Korea pass through these waters. Container ships carrying electronics, machinery, and consumer goods travel the same routes. Whoever maintains a forward position in this area can monitor ship traffic, expand surveillance coverage, and potentially project military power far beyond the reef itself. In other words, Mischief Reef may look like a tiny speck on a map, but strategically, it sits in one of the busiest crossroads of the global economy. Of course, geography alone doesn't determine ownership. The real conflict emerges from overlapping territorial claims. China argues that much of the South China Sea falls within its historical maritime boundary known as the Nine-Dash Line. This sweeping claim stretches across vast portions of the sea and overlaps with the maritime zones of several Southeast Asian states. But under modern international law, that claim has faced serious challenges. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration issued a landmark ruling in a case brought by the Philippines. The tribunal concluded that China's claim of historic rights within the Nine-Dash Line had no legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It also confirmed that Mischief Reef lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Legally speaking, the decision was a major victory for Manila. In practical terms, however, the situation on the water did not change much. China rejected the ruling outright and continued to maintain its presence across several features in the Spratly Islands, including Mischief Reef. Meanwhile, other regional actors such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan also maintain claims over parts of the Spratly chain. Still, the standoff between China and the Philippines remains the most intense around Mischief Reef. And that raises the question that sits at the center of this whole story. How did a reef that technically lies within the Philippines' maritime zone end up under China's effective control? To answer that, you have to go back to the 1990s, when the first structures quietly appeared above the water. In 2013 and 2016, China launched one of the most ambitious land reclamation efforts ever attempted in disputed waters. Dredging ships arrived and began pumping massive amounts of sand and sediment onto the reef. Slowly, the submerged coral formation started to grow into something entirely different. What had once been an underwater atoll was reshaped into a sprawling artificial island covering more than 1,379 acres. Satellite images from those years show the transformation almost like a time-lapse film. First came the dredgers and construction barges. Then came the seawalls, runways, and concrete structures. Before long, Mischief Reef looked less like a reef and more like a fully engineered base rising out of the sea. But the physical construction was only part of the strategy. Alongside the expansion, Beijing continued to reinforce its claim through diplomatic messaging and official maps referencing the Nine-Dash Line. Chinese officials repeatedly described their activities as legitimate development within what they considered historical maritime rights. At the same time, China engaged in bilateral discussions with regional states, including the Philippines. Critics argued that these negotiations often created the appearance of dialogue without changing the reality of China's growing presence on the water. The legal challenge came in 2016, when the Permanent Court of Arbitration issued its landmark ruling in a case brought by the Philippines. The tribunal concluded that China's expansive claims had no legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and confirmed that Mischief Reef lies within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. On paper, it looked like a decisive legal victory for Manila. But in practice, the ruling did not alter the situation on the ground. Beijing rejected the decision outright, calling it null and void, and continued building and maintaining its installations across the Spratly Islands. Meanwhile, the artificial island at Mischief Reef evolved into something far more sophisticated than a reclaimed sandbar. Long runways capable of supporting military aircraft appeared, along with hangars, radar facilities, and harbor structures designed to accommodate naval vessels. Analysts believe the installations can support advanced surveillance systems and surface-to-air missile platforms, extending China's ability to monitor and potentially control large portions of the surrounding sea. This transformation effectively turned the reef into a forward military outpost, one capable of supporting what strategists call area denial operations, where surveillance, aircraft, and missile systems combine to discourage or limit the movement of other forces. Yet perhaps the most subtle element of China's approach lies in what security analysts describe as gray zone tactics. Rather than relying solely on conventional naval deployments, Chinese Coast Guard ships and maritime militia vessels frequently patrol contested waters. These ships often shadow Philippine fishing boats, block resupply missions, or use aggressive maneuvers such as ramming or water cannon blasts. The actions are confrontational, but carefully calibrated to stay below the threshold of open military conflict. It's a strategy that slowly reshapes control without triggering the kind of direct confrontation that might force a larger international response. That response, when it has come, has been limited. The United States and several allied navies regularly conduct operations meant to challenge what they view as excessive maritime claims. These missions, often referred to as freedom of navigation operations, involve naval vessels sailing through contested waters to demonstrate that international sea lanes remain open. But these patrols are temporary by nature. Ships pass through and continue on their way. Mischief Reef, by contrast, remains fixed in place, a permanent structure sitting in the middle of disputed waters. And that permanence is what makes the situation so difficult to reverse. What began as a cluster of modest shelters in the 1990s has gradually evolved into a fortified artificial island, backed by one of the world's most powerful militaries. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question facing policymakers in Manila today. Now that China has entrenched itself there, is it even possible for the Philippines to push back? For the Philippines, the story of Mischief Reef isn't just a distant geopolitical dispute. It has real consequences that ripple through the country's economy, security planning, and political debates at home. The first impact shows up in the fishing communities along the coast of Palawan and other nearby provinces. For generations, Filipino fishermen sailed freely across the waters that surround the reef. These areas are among the richest fishing grounds in the South China Sea, providing tuna, reef fish, and other catches that sustain local livelihoods. But as Chinese patrols and fleets expanded their presence in the area, access became more restricted and unpredictable. Some fishermen report being chased away, while others avoid the waters altogether out of fear of confrontation. The economic effects add up quickly. Fisheries contribute roughly 1.3% of the Philippines' GDP and support the livelihoods of more than 1.6 million Filipinos. When fishing grounds become contested or inaccessible, it doesn't just affect individual boats, it hits coastal economies, local markets, and food security across entire communities. Security concerns run even deeper. The military infrastructure now established on Mischief Reef strengthens China's broader anti-access and area denial capabilities, often shortened to A2 or AD in strategic discussions. In practical terms, this means China can extend surveillance coverage, deploy aircraft, and potentially operate missile systems capable of influencing activity across large parts of the surrounding sea. For the Philippines, that complicates efforts to patrol its own maritime claims or respond quickly to incidents in disputed waters. The situation also carries political weight inside the Philippines. Each encounter at sea, whether involving fishermen, Coast Guard vessels, or resupply missions, quickly becomes national news. Critics often accuse the government of reacting too cautiously, arguing that Manila should defend its maritime rights more assertively. Others argue that confrontation with a far more powerful neighbor could create greater risks. As a result, every administration faces the same difficult balancing act, defending sovereignty while avoiding a crisis that could spiral out of control. Diplomatically, the challenge becomes even more delicate. China remains one of the Philippines' largest trading partners and an important economic player in the region. At the same time, Manila has deepened defense cooperation with partners such as the United States, Japan, and Australia in response to rising tensions in the South China Sea. Navigating these relationships requires careful diplomacy. Too much confrontation with Beijing risks economic fallout, while too little resistance risks weakening Manila's maritime claims. This is the strategic tightrope the Philippines now walks every day. When analysts ask whether the Philippines can stop China at Mischief Reef, the answer usually begins with a realistic assessment of military power. China's naval and coast guard fleets are vastly larger than those of the Philippines. The scale difference is hard to ignore. China operates one of the world's largest navies, backed by an extensive coast guard and maritime militia network. The Philippine Navy, by contrast, remains in the process of modernization and operates with far fewer vessels and limited resources. This imbalance makes any unilateral military attempt to remove China from Mischief Reef extremely unlikely. Because of that gap, Philippine strategy increasingly focuses on asymmetric approaches rather than direct confrontation. Strengthening coastal surveillance systems, improving maritime domain awareness, and deploying defensive missile capabilities can help raise the cost of aggression without triggering a full-scale military conflict. Joint patrols and coordinated monitoring operations with allied forces also play a role in maintaining a presence in contested waters. Diplomacy remains another key tool. The Philippines continues to highlight the legal significance of the 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which confirmed that China's sweeping claims have no legal basis under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. By consistently invoking international law in diplomatic forums, Manila keeps global attention focused on the dispute and reinforces the legitimacy of its position. Regional cooperation could also matter, although it comes with its own challenges. Within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, member states hold different views on how strongly to confront China. Some depend heavily on economic ties with Beijing, which often makes consensus difficult. Still, a stronger and more unified regional stance could gradually increase diplomatic pressure for rules-based behavior in the South China Sea. Economic and strategic partnerships also play a growing role. The Philippines has expanded cooperation with the United States, Japan, and Australia through military exercises, technology transfers, and intelligence sharing. These partnerships strengthen maritime awareness and help the Philippines monitor developments across its surrounding waters more effectively. Even so, most analysts agree on a sobering reality. Reversing China's physical presence at Mischief Reef through military means is highly improbable. The more realistic objective is containment, limiting further expansion, reinforcing legal claims, and ensuring that no single power can dominate the entire region unchecked. The experience of Mischief Reef offers important lessons, not only for the Philippines, but for the wider region. For the Philippines itself, the situation highlights the importance of preparedness and long-term strategic planning. Legal victories, such as the arbitration ruling, matter enormously in shaping international opinion. But without sustained diplomatic engagement, military readiness, and strong partnerships, legal arguments alone cannot enforce maritime rights. For regional organizations like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the dispute reveals the risks of fragmentation. When member states approach maritime disputes with differing priorities, it becomes easier for stronger powers to shape the strategic environment. A more coordinated regional framework could help smaller states defend shared interests and uphold international law. For global powers, the situation represents a broader test of the international system. The dispute touches on fundamental questions about freedom of navigation, the authority of international legal institutions, and the balance between power and law in international relations. The way these issues are managed in the South China Sea may influence how similar disputes are handled elsewhere in the future. China's consolidation of control over Mischief Reef illustrates a difficult reality of modern geopolitics. Even when international law appears clear, as demonstrated by the 2016 arbitration ruling, strategic realities on the ground can tell a different story. For the Philippines, reversing China's presence at the reef alone is unlikely, but that does not mean the situation is entirely beyond influence. Through persistent diplomacy, stronger alliances, and continued engagement with international institutions, Manila can shape the broader environment in which the dispute unfolds. In the end, the future of the South China Sea will depend not just on military strength, but on the willingness of regional states and global powers to defend the principles of maritime law and cooperative security. Because if those principles weaken, the consequences will stretch far beyond a single reef rising out of the water. They will shape the balance of power and the stability of one of the world's most important oceans for decades to come.
If you found this analysis valuable, share your perspective in the comments. Your insights help deepen the conversation and sharpen our understanding of evolving regional dynamics. Thank you, and we will see you soon in our next geopolitical discussion.
Start with the math. Everything else flows from it. In Malaysia's Sabah state, fishermen can legally buy subsidized diesel for 2.10 ringgit per liter, about 53 US cents. Now cross the Sulu Sea. In the southern Philippines, the same fuel sells for roughly 50 pesos per liter, or 85 US cents. That is a 32-cent gap on every liter. On land, this difference barely registers. At sea, it matters. A lot. Fuel moves in bulk. Demand never stops. Oversight thins out quickly once you leave the shoreline. In that environment, even a modest margin becomes profitable. This is not theft born of desperation. It is arbitrage created by policy. Fuel gains value simply by crossing water. There is no refining, no transformation, just distance, borders, and mismatched prices. And fuel has three advantages that make it ideal for this kind of economy. It stores easily, it is difficult to trace, and it is essential to everyday life. Small margins, repeated often enough, scale fast. This is the core transaction. It is the engine of the system. The boats, the routes, the informal networks, they all exist because this price gap exists. The Sulu Sea smuggling economy does not begin with criminals or ideology. It begins with numbers that fail to align across borders. Once the incentive is clear, the next question is scale. How large is this trade, in real terms? According to Malaysian authorities, Marine police seized the following last year alone: roughly 90,000 liters of petrol, nearly 1 million liters of diesel. The estimated value of these seizures was 88 million ringgit, or about 22 million US dollars. That number matters, but not for the reason it first appears. These figures do not represent the total trade. They represent what was intercepted. Seizures tell us three things. First, this is not small-time smuggling. Moving close to 1 million liters of diesel requires planning, storage, vessels, and coordination. This is organized activity, not opportunism. Second, the trade is persistent. Authorities speak of dozens of cases. These are patterns, not exceptions. And third, and most important, interceptions capture only a fraction of what is actually moving. In maritime smuggling, seizures are a lagging indicator. They show activity, not control. If this much fuel is being caught, far more is getting through. Quietly, routinely, profitably. The scale of the seizures does not prove enforcement is succeeding. It suggests the system has already become industrial. To understand why this trade continues, you have to look at the water itself. Sabah's eastern coast sits less than 120 kilometers from the southern islands of the Philippines. At its narrowest point, near the Semporna Island chain, the distance shrinks to just 18 kilometers. That is not a sea barrier. It is a short boat ride. The Sulu Sea is crowded with small islands, shallow channels, and narrow straits. Fishing routes have run through these waters for generations. For local fishermen, this is familiar ground. For enforcement agencies, it is a maze. Large patrol vessels struggle to operate here. Radar coverage breaks down. Small boats move easily, disappear quickly, and blend into legitimate traffic without effort. The geography naturally favors speed over surveillance. Local knowledge over state authority. Informality over regulation. In effect, the sea itself works against enforcement. The key point is this. The Sulu Sea is not difficult to police because states are weak. It is difficult to police because the geography is stronger. On a map, the maritime boundary between Malaysia and the Philippines looks clear. At sea, it rarely is. The Sulu Sea is a patchwork of overlapping patrol zones, unclear boundaries, and fragmented enforcement authority. Multiple agencies operate in the same waters, often with limited coordination and slow information sharing. This creates gaps, and smugglers understand those gaps far better than states do. Fuel can move from one jurisdiction to another in minutes. Legal responsibility follows much more slowly, tangled in paperwork and radio calls. Malaysian authorities have pointed to fuel storage sites on small islands near the maritime boundary. These locations sit in a regulatory gray area. Storage limits are unclear. Inspections are limited. Oversight is uneven. Once fuel is staged on these islands, monitoring becomes far more difficult. The result is a border that exists in law, but fades in practice the farther you move from shore. At sea, sovereignty weakens with distance. Gray zone actors operate precisely in that space. What sets this case apart from routine smuggling is the level of official candor. Authorities are not guessing how this happens. They are describing it. Malaysia's Agriculture and Food Security Minister, Muhammad Sabu, has acknowledged that fishermen can legally purchase their full subsidized fuel quotas even when they do not need all of it. The unused fuel does not vanish. It is resold. Not stolen, not siphoned, but redirected into the black market. That distinction matters. It shows the core problem is not a failure of enforcement. It is a flaw in policy design. Sabah's Regional Marine Police Commander, Ahmad Amri Abdul Rahman, has echoed this point. He notes that enforcement is made harder by the dense spread of islands near international borders. Taken together, these statements reveal something important. The state understands how fuel exits the legal system. It knows where the fuel goes. And it understands why stopping the trade is so difficult. Yet the structure remains unchanged. This gray zone economy is not hidden. It operates in plain sight, inside loopholes that are openly acknowledged. Malaysia introduced fuel subsidies for fishermen in 2006. The goal was simple: protect livelihoods from rising fuel costs and keep coastal communities afloat. On paper, the policy worked. Fishermen gained reliable access to cheap diesel. Operating costs fell. Incomes became more predictable. But in the Sulu Sea, the subsidy did not stay national. It became portable value. Once fuel is subsidized at the point of purchase, it stops being just an input. It turns into a tradable asset. A liter of diesel bought legally in Sabah gains value the moment it enters a different pricing system. No law is broken at the point of sale. The distortion appears only after the fuel starts moving. This is how a welfare policy slides into a gray zone economy. Legal purchase. Informal transfer. Cross-border resale. All of it enabled by geography and uneven prices. Subsidies work inside borders. Markets do not respect them. Smuggling does not survive on supply alone. It survives because there is demand on the other side. In the southern Philippines, fuel prices are consistently higher than in Sabah. Diesel sells for around 50 pesos per liter, or roughly 85 US cents. For coastal communities and small operators, fuel is not optional. It powers fishing boats, small transport vessels, and generators in off-grid areas. But fuel distribution in the region is uneven. Infrastructure is weaker. Supply chains are longer. State presence fades as you move farther from major ports. Smuggled fuel fills that gap. It arrives by sea. It is sold locally. And it is often cheaper or simply more available than official supplies. This is the critical point. For many communities, the black market is not a luxury or a convenience. It is the most functional energy system available. Smuggled fuel persists not because demand is criminal, but because access is structural. When governments respond to smuggling, the instinct is almost always the same. Add more patrols, make more seizures, put more boats at sea. In the Sulu Sea, enforcement has not been absent. Fuel has been seized. Smuggling runs have been disrupted. Networks have been broken, at least temporarily. Yet the trade continues. That is because enforcement targets movement, not motivation. As long as fuel in Sabah remains subsidized, prices in the southern Philippines remain higher, and maritime borders remain porous, the incentive structure stays intact. Every seizure removes cargo. It does not remove the reason that cargo exists. In some cases, enforcement even raises profits. Higher risk makes successful runs more valuable. Without changes to subsidy design, quota controls, and regional coordination, patrols become repetitive and reactive. The key takeaway is simple. You can intercept boats. You cannot patrol away a price gap. What is happening in the Sulu Sea is not just smuggling. It is a functioning gray zone system. Gray zones exist between war and peace, legality and illegality, state control and state absence. They are low in visibility, non-ideological, economically rational, and politically deniable. Fuel smuggling in the Sulu Sea fits this pattern almost perfectly. No flags are raised. Borders are not openly challenged. There is no military escalation. And yet, state authority is quietly worn down. The same routes used to move subsidized diesel can, and often do, support arms trafficking, narcotics flows, and human smuggling. Fuel is simply the most visible and least controversial cargo. That is what makes it dangerous. Gray zone economies normalize cross-border illegality without forcing states to respond forcefully. They persist because they stay below the threshold of crisis. The Sulu Sea is not unstable because of open conflict. It is unstable because informal systems are working better than formal ones. So, why does this keep happening, year after year, seizure after seizure? Because nothing at the core has changed. Fuel in Sabah remains subsidized. Fuel in the southern Philippines remains more expensive. And the Sulu Sea remains what it has always been: a maze of islands, short crossings, and weak coordination. This is not a failure of patrols. It is a mismatch between policy, geography, and regional integration. As long as price gaps move faster than regulation, gray zone actors will continue to profit. The lesson is straightforward. Smuggling in the Sulu Sea is not an anomaly. It is a rational response to structural conditions. Until subsidies are redesigned, borders are managed cooperatively, and peripheral regions are economically integrated, enforcement will remain reactive, and the gray zone will remain active. The Sulu Sea does not reward lawlessness. It rewards alignment with reality. happens when the world's busiest trade highway turns into a naval chessboard? That's the question hanging heavy over Asia right now. In the latest jolt of breaking news, Chinese warships and Coast Guard vessels have surged back into contested waters of the South China Sea, shadowing U.S. naval activity and circling flashpoints like Scarborough Shoal. One regional security official summed it up bluntly: "This is no longer signaling, this is positioning." And suddenly, Manila is on high alert, allies are dialing each other up, and the calm blue waters are starting to look dangerously crowded. Picture this for a second: a stretch of sea carrying nearly $3 trillion in global trade every year, now packed with destroyers, patrol ships, and combat aircraft flying too close for comfort. This isn't some distant maritime dispute, it's the route your fuel, food, electronics, and energy supplies travel through. Scarborough Shoal, just a short sail from the Philippine coast, has once again become ground zero, with China flexing power and the Philippines responding by tightening coordination with the United States and regional partners. One wrong move here doesn't just make headlines, it rewrites security equations. And that's why this moment hits different. This isn't about one patrol or one provocation, it's about who controls the rules of the sea. Beijing's deployments challenge freedom of navigation, test international law, and directly push back against U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific. For the Philippines, it's an uncomfortable reminder that sovereignty isn't abstract. It's defended in real time, under real pressure. The South China Sea is no longer simmering in the background. It's boiling, and the world is watching to see who blinks first. All right, let's set the stage properly because none of this is random, and none of it started yesterday. The South China Sea has been contested for decades, long before today's headlines and warship movements. China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all lay overlapping claims to islands, reefs, and waters in this strategically priceless maritime zone. On paper, many of these claims are supposed to be governed by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and maritime rights. In reality, power politics often outweigh legal diagrams. What should be clear-cut lines on a map have turned into gray zones patrolled by coast guards, naval vessels, and surveillance aircraft.
What you see on the screen is a depiction of the South China Sea, and you see the red dashes around the perimeter of the South China Sea.
The tension exploded into legal warfare in 2016, when an international arbitral tribunal in The Hague delivered a landmark ruling in favor of the Philippines. The court decisively struck down China's sweeping 9-line claim, declaring it had no legal basis under UNCLOS. For Manila, the verdict was a diplomatic weapon, proof that international law was on its side. For Beijing, it was a red line. China rejected the ruling outright, calling it null and void, and has since acted as if it never existed. That legal standoff still defines today's confrontations. The Philippines cites the ruling in protests and speeches, while Chinese ships continue operating as if the map never changed. Layered on top of this is the constant presence of the United States Navy, which views the South China Sea not as a regional dispute, but as a global test case. Through regular freedom of navigation operations (FNOP), U.S. warships deliberately sail near contested features, including recent patrols close to Scarborough Shoal, to challenge what Washington calls excessive maritime claims. The message is old school but crystal clear: the seas stay open, no matter who tries to fence them off. As U.S. officials put it, these missions defend the right to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. And every time an American ship shows up, Chinese vessels shadow it, turning the South China Sea into a high-stakes standoff where law, history, and raw power collide. Now here's where things get real. Because this isn't just talk anymore, it's steel in the water and aircraft in the sky. Over the past few days, China has rolled out serious naval and air power into waters claimed by the Philippines. And the composition of these forces matters. Guided missile destroyers and frigates, not symbolic patrol boats, have been tracked operating close to sensitive areas, signaling high-end combat readiness rather than routine law enforcement presence. These platforms are built for air defense, anti-ship warfare, and long-range operations. Meaning, this deployment is designed to be seen, noted, and calculated by everyone watching the radar screens. Even more eye-catching is the aerial component. China has flown H-6 strategic bombers, aircraft capable of carrying YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missiles with an estimated strike range of up to 500 kilometers. That's not defensive posturing, that's a clear reminder of reach. From those distances, major naval formations, ports, and sea lanes fall well within potential engagement zones. In simple terms, Beijing is quietly saying, we can hit far, and we can hit fast. Officially, China's Southern Theater Command is playing it cool. The patrols are described as routine, while Manila is accused of colluding with external forces, diplomatic shorthand for working too closely with the United States and its allies. According to Beijing, these deployments are meant to preserve peace and stability. It's a familiar script: assert dominance, deny escalation, blame the other side. Old playbook, new hardware. At the core, China's stated objective remains unchanged. Beijing insists it is defending territorial sovereignty and responding to what it calls provocations by rival claimants and outside powers meddling in regional affairs. But the scale and sophistication of the forces involved tell a deeper story. This isn't just about protecting claims. It's about shaping behavior, intimidating opponents, and setting red lines in real time. In the South China Sea, China isn't asking for attention anymore. It's commanding it. Washington didn't waste time responding, and it responded the way it always has, by showing up, staying visible, and refusing to blink. The U.S. Navy has surged Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers alongside littoral combat ships into waters near disputed shoals, reinforcing what officials call a persistent presence in the South China Sea. These aren't ceremonial sail-bys. Arleigh Burkes are among the most capable surface combatants afloat, packed with Aegis air defense systems, cruise missiles, and anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Their deployment sends a quiet but unmistakable signal. The U.S. is prepared to operate in contested waters and stay there. At the heart of this posture is freedom of navigation operations, a doctrine Washington treats almost like sacred tradition. U.S. officials stress that these operations are fully consistent with international law and not aimed at any single country, even if everyone knows who's being challenged. One Pentagon spokesperson cut straight through the noise, stating that China's maritime claims do not deter us. In plain terms, the message is simple and old school. No nation gets to rewrite the rules of the sea by force. But beneath the tough talk lies a very real danger. The South China Sea has already seen near misses, aggressive shadowing, and even collisions between Chinese vessels during high-speed maneuvers. Add American warships, Chinese destroyers, bombers overhead, and Coast Guard vessels weaving between them, and the margin for error shrinks fast. A misjudged turn, a misread radar contact, or an overly aggressive intercept could trigger a crisis no one actually planned for. That's the uncomfortable truth of the current U.S. posture. Deterrence keeps the peace until it doesn't. And in these crowded waters, where pride, power, and patrol routes collide, escalation doesn't need intent. It only needs one bad moment. For Manila, this isn't theory or great power abstraction. This is happening right off its coast, and the response has been sharp, public, and deliberate. The Philippine government has moved quickly on the diplomatic front, issuing official protests and lodging firm representations with the Chinese embassy over both Beijing's rhetoric and its expanding maritime presence. Philippine officials have pushed back hard against accusations of collusion, stressing that defending sovereign rights is not provocation. In statements from Malacanang and the Department of Foreign Affairs, the message is consistent. China's actions are being challenged on record, in writing, and through international channels. No quiet acceptance, no silent retreat. At sea, the posture has tightened. The Philippine Navy and Philippine Coast Guard have stepped up patrols across the West Philippine Sea, keeping a closer watch on contested areas and maintaining presence near sensitive features. While Manila knows it cannot match China ship for ship, visibility itself has become a form of resistance. Each patrol shows the same point: these waters are not abandoned, and sovereignty isn't surrendered just because the other side is bigger. Diplomatically, the Philippines is also playing the long game. Coordination with the United States remains central, especially through joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and operational planning under existing defense agreements. At the same time, Manila continues engaging ASEAN partners, pushing for unity, consultations, and a rules-based approach to maritime security. It's a careful balancing act, strengthening alliances without triggering outright escalation. The Philippine response is quiet but firm, cautious but unmistakable. Manila isn't pounding the table, but it isn't backing down either. In a region where silence can be mistaken for consent, the Philippines is making one thing clear: it's present, it's watching, and it intends to stand its ground. What's unfolding in the South China Sea doesn't stay neatly boxed inside national borders, it ripples across the entire region. For ASEAN, these tensions are a stress test of unity. Some member states are deeply uneasy about being dragged into a confrontation between major powers, preferring quiet diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. Others, especially claimant states, are increasingly vocal about the need to push back against coercive behavior before it becomes the new normal. The result is a familiar Asian dilemma: consensus versus credibility. Every flare-up exposes how hard it is to speak with one voice when national interests, threat perceptions, and economic ties to China all pull in different directions. The economic stakes raise the temperature even further. The South China Sea isn't just geopolitically sensitive, it's economically indispensable. These waters carry critical shipping lanes and energy routes that feed East Asian manufacturing hubs, fuel markets, and consumer supply chains. Any serious disruption, whether from military standoffs or heightened insurance risks, would ripple straight into ports, prices, and production lines. For economies built on just-in-time trade, even short-term instability can translate into long-term uncertainty. Then there's the most immediate danger: maritime safety. The sea is getting crowded, and not just with warships. Military vessels, Coast Guard cutters, and maritime militia are operating in close quarters, often at high speed and under political pressure. Each aggressive maneuver, each shadowing incident, raises the odds of an accident, and in this environment, accidents don't stay accidents for long. One collision, one misread intention, and the region could find itself in an escalatory spiral no one planned for, but everyone would have to deal with. In short, the South China Sea is becoming more than a dispute zone, it's a regional fault line. And the longer tensions simmer, the harder it becomes for Asian, markets, and mariners alike to pretend this is business as usual. At the core of all this naval muscle flexing is a much quieter battlefield, international law, and that fight may be the most consequential of all. The legal backbone of the South China Sea disputes is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Under UNCLOS, coastal states are granted clearly defined maritime entitlements, including territorial seas and exclusive economic zones extending up to 200 nautical miles. This framework is what anchors the Philippines' legal position in the West Philippine Sea. Manila argues that its claims aren't based on power or history, but on codified international law that most of the world recognizes and follows. In theory, UNCLOS is supposed to remove ambiguity. In practice, it's become the very thing being contested. China, however, plays by a different script. Beijing asserts historical rights that it argues predate UNCLOS and justify its extensive presence and deployments across much of the South China Sea. This interpretation has been widely challenged, especially after the 2016 arbitral ruling, but China continues to treat these claims as non-negotiable. From Beijing's perspective, patrols, exercises, and ship deployments are not violations. They are enforcement of long-held sovereignty. Law, in this view, bends to history and power. The United States cuts straight across that argument. Washington insists that freedom of navigation and overflight are protected under UNCLOS norms and customary international law, regardless of competing sovereignty claims. That's the legal logic behind U.S. freedom of navigation operations. They are not about ownership of reefs or shoals, but about preventing any single state from turning international waters into restricted zones. Every FONOP is a legal statement made with a warship. And that's the real tension. One side sees law as fixed rules, the other treats it as flexible history. Until those visions align or one clearly prevails, the South China Sea will remain not just a military standoff, but a legal one, fought ship by ship, patrol by patrol. When you strip away the press statements and naval posturing, what's left is a tense strategic equation, and none of the outcomes are guaranteed to stay tidy. One possible path is de-escalation, driven by sustained diplomacy, military hotlines, and confidence-building measures. This is the scenario everyone publicly claims to want: fewer risky maneuvers, clearer communication, and a return to managed competition. But let's be real, de-escalation in the South China Sea doesn't mean ships go home. It means tensions are contained, not resolved, and restraint becomes a daily operational choice rather than a permanent fix. The more likely near-term scenario is a prolonged standoff. Persistent patrols, shadowing operations, and shows of force continue, but without major incidents. Friction becomes normalized. Each side learns the other's habits, thresholds, and red lines. This kind of frozen confrontation feels stable on the surface, but it's exhausting, expensive, and inherently fragile. One political crisis elsewhere or one aggressive captain at sea can shatter the balance overnight. The most dangerous scenario is escalation, and the scary part is that it wouldn't have to be intentional. An unintended collision, an aircraft intercept gone wrong, or a misinterpreted radar lock could trigger rapid military responses before diplomacy has time to catch up. In an environment thick with nationalism and alliance commitments, even a minor incident can spiral faster than leaders can control. Complicating all of this is the accelerating technological edge. Advanced missile platforms, long-range strike systems, real-time surveillance drones, and networked sensors are compressing decision-making timelines. Commanders now see more, track faster, and react quicker, which sounds stabilizing until it isn't. Speed reduces room for human judgment, and in contested waters, that can turn seconds into strategic consequences. Bottom line, the South China Sea isn't drifting toward resolution, it's hardening into a test of endurance, discipline, and crisis management. The danger isn't war by design, it's war by miscalculation, and history tells us that's often how the worst ones start. Zoom out for a second, and it's obvious the South China Sea isn't just about reefs and shoals anymore, it's a front line in the US. China strategic rivalry. Every patrol, every statement, every joint exercise feeds into a much larger contest over influence, credibility, and leadership in the Indo-Pacific. For Washington, presence equals commitment to allies, to international law, to an open maritime order. For Beijing, pushing back is about reshaping that order and proving it can no longer be dictated from outside the region. The result? Alliances are tightening, defense cooperation is deepening, and neutral ground is getting harder to find. Multilateral diplomacy is supposed to be the pressure valve, but progress has been painfully slow. UN platforms and related mechanisms offer space for dialogue, confidence building, and rule setting. Yet consensus remains elusive. Competing interests, economic dependencies, and strategic caution keep outcomes watered down. The long-discussed code of conduct in the South China Sea, for example, moves forward inch by inch, always discussed, never quite delivered. Still, these forums matter. In a crisis-prone environment, even slow diplomacy is better than silence. That's why dialogue, however imperfect, remains essential. Military deterrence may prevent immediate conflict, but only sustained diplomatic engagement and respect for international norms can prevent long-term instability. Hotlines, maritime communication protocols, and regular consultations don't solve sovereignty disputes, but they can stop misunderstandings from turning into flashpoints. In a region this tense, talking is not weakness, it's damage control. What we're witnessing now is a clear escalation in geopolitical intensity. China's expanded naval deployments, the United States' firm maritime posture, and the Philippines' heightened state of alert all point to a South China Sea that is more contested, more crowded, and more consequential than ever. This isn't a temporary spike, it's a new normal taking shape in real time. The risks are obvious and serious. Military operations intersect with strategic rivalry and unresolved legal claims, creating a volatile mix where miscalculation could carry regional, even global consequences. Trade routes, energy flows, alliance credibility, and international law are all on the line. When great power competition plays out at sea, the margin for error is dangerously thin. The path forward is narrow but clear. Stronger diplomacy, greater transparency, and consistent adherence to lawful maritime conduct are no longer optional. They're essential. The South China Sea has always been a crossroads of commerce and culture. Whether it becomes a corridor of cooperation or a theater of confrontation depends on the choices being made right now, while the ships are still maneuvering and the lines are not yet crossed.
Get out there!
What does it mean when a state stops calling harassment harassment and starts calling it piracy? That single word choice, loaded with centuries of legal, moral, and strategic weight, is what made the latest confrontation at 2nd Thomas Shoal fundamentally different from the dozens of incidents that preceded it. When the Philippines publicly accused China of piracy following a violent encounter in the South China Sea, it was not merely describing an event at sea. It was signaling a shift in narrative, posture, and possibly escalation thresholds. The incident itself followed a now familiar pattern. Philippine vessels conducting a resupply mission to 2nd Thomas Shoal were confronted by Chinese maritime forces employing aggressive maneuvering, boarding actions, and the seizure of equipment. Such encounters have occurred repeatedly in recent years. What changed was Manila's framing. By invoking piracy, a term rooted in international law and historically associated with criminal violence beyond state authority, the Philippines implicitly challenged Beijing's attempt to normalize coercion under the guise of law enforcement and sovereignty patrols. This rhetorical escalation matters because language shapes legitimacy. Most Southeast Asian states facing pressure from China have relied on calibrated, cautious phrasing. Unsafe maneuvers, incidents, or miscalculations. Vietnam has protested. Malaysia has quietly reinforced. Indonesia has renamed waters and strengthened patrols, all while avoiding labels that could legally or diplomatically harden positions. By contrast, the Philippines has increasingly chosen clarity over ambiguity. Calling an act piracy
reframes the encounter from a bilateral dispute into a question of international order, rules at sea, and collective response. Strategically, the episode fits squarely within China's established pattern of gray zone maritime coercion, the deliberate use of Coast Guard, maritime militia, and quasi-civilian assets to apply force without crossing the threshold of declared armed conflict. What makes this case distinct is how it intersects with alliance dynamics.
Our mutual defense treaty is the bedrock of that. We share concerns about China's coercion in the South China Sea.
Unlike many regional states, the Philippines operates under a formal mutual defense treaty with the United States, conducts regular joint patrols, and has openly aligned its maritime posture with broader Indo-Pacific deterrence efforts. The piracy accusation, therefore, resonates far beyond the reef itself, raising questions about precedent, escalation control, and how far coercion can go before it triggers collective security mechanisms. In that sense, Second Thomas Shoal is no longer just a rusting ship on a submerged reef. It has become a test case of narrative power, of legal framing, and of whether sustained gray zone pressure can still hide behind technicalities when the language of international crime enters the conversation.
At the heart of the latest South China Sea confrontation lies Second Thomas Shoal, also called Ayungin Shoal by the Philippines. A low-lying reef roughly 105 nautical miles west of Palawan that sits well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, EEZ, as defined under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tayo.
Manila has maintained a permanent presence there since 1999 by grounding the aging transport BRP Sierra Madre to reinforce its territorial claim, a symbolic fixture of sovereignty that China continues to contest.
There was a roaring mission to BRP Sierra Madre. No untoward incident. There were 4 Coast Guard ships of the China that were spotted, but they did not do any coercive nor aggressive actions.
On June 17, 2024, a routine rotation and reprovisioning RORE mission by the Armed Forces of the Philippines, AFP, to deliver food, water, and other supplies to personnel aboard Sierra Madre devolved into violence when Chinese Coast Guard vessels aggressively intervened. According to the Philippines, Chinese personnel boarded at least one Philippine boat using cutlasses, spears, and knives, forcing Filipino sailors to defend themselves without firearms, per operational orders.
Tropa natin yan.
Manila reports that 8 Filipino personnel were wounded during the clash, including one sailor who lost his right thumb amid the melee. Philippine military leadership did not mince words.
The Coast Guard ang nag-rescue sa ating mga wounded personnel. Sila rin nagbigay ng first aid.
AFP Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. publicly characterized the episode as akin to piracy, stating that Chinese personnel had seized 7 rifles still boxed for delivery and damaged communications and navigational equipment on the Filipino vessels. In a formal demand to Beijing, Manila later insisted on 60 million Filipino pesos in compensation for the equipment loss and the injuries sustained by Seaman First Class Jeffrey Facundo, whose medical care for the severed digit was part of the total cost estimate. From Manila's perspective, the weapons involved were not firearms, but bladed or improvised handheld implements used by Chinese forces during boarding, showing the irregular and brazen nature of the clash that triggered Manila's piracy label. Beijing, however, offered a sharply different account, rejecting Manila's narrative as distorted and insisting that Chinese actions were reasonable, lawful, professional, and restrained. even as its Coast Guard continued patrols in contested areas. In the immediate aftermath, the Philippine Coast Guard and Navy bolstered their presence around Second Thomas Shoal, deploying additional vessels and conducting more frequent patrols to deter further interference. Moves the AFP described as necessary to uphold navigation rights and protect Filipino personnel operating in waters Manila considers sovereign.
To an identified foreign vessel at Sabina Shoal, this is Philippine Coast Guard, VRP Cabra MRRV 4409.
This incident did not occur in isolation. It fits into a broader pattern of maritime confrontations between the two countries, ranging from water cannon engagements against Filipino fishing boats in December 2025 to repeated blocking and collision incidents near Scarborough Shoal and other contested features of the South China Sea.
To understand why tensions keep boiling over at Second Thomas Shoal, you have to stop thinking of it as just a reef on a map. It sits inside the Spratly Islands, one of the most hotly contested island systems in the world, and just a short distance from major sea lanes that carry trillions of dollars in trade through the South China Sea every year. Control here is not symbolic. It shapes who watches, who moves, and who decides what is normal at sea. For the Philippines, the shoal is deeply personal. Since 1999, Manila has maintained a constant presence through the grounded BRP Sierra Madre, a rusting World War II-era vessel deliberately run aground and turned into a living outpost. Filipino Marines rotate through harsh conditions, relying on periodic resupply missions for food, water, and medicine. Every successful run is quiet proof that the Philippines is still there. Every blocked mission feels like a test of resolve. That is where the pattern begins. Time after time, Chinese vessels have attempted to block, shadow, or physically disrupt Philippine resupply efforts. These are rarely dramatic naval battles. Instead, they unfold as tense standoffs at close range, ships cutting across bows, engines throttling forward, horns blaring, crews shouting across decks. The objective is not to sink a ship, but to exhaust, intimidate, and normalize interference without firing a shot.
Sa ngayon, nagbuga na naman ng tubig ang water cannon.
Since 2021, the Philippine Coast Guard has done something unusual in maritime disputes. It has turned cameras outward. Video after video released by the PCG shows Chinese vessels using water cannons, executing dangerous close-quarter maneuvers, and deliberately obstructing Philippine boats on humanitarian and military resupply missions. These clips matter because they strip away abstraction. You see sailors knocked off balance by high-pressure water jets. You hear engines straining as hulls pass within meters of collision. It is pressure made visible.
Hey! Stop! Hey! Stop! 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 Get out there!
What makes Second Thomas Shoal different from other disputed features is repetition. This is not a one-off crisis that fades from headlines. It is a cycle. Resupply planned, interference anticipated, confrontation likely. Each encounter builds on the last, slowly raising stakes while testing how much friction can be applied before something snaps. Over time, the shoal has evolved from a static claim into a living stress test of endurance, credibility, and deterrence in the South China Sea. In short, Second Thomas Shoal is not dangerous because of what it is, but because of what keeps happening there, again and again, in plain sight.
Under international law, piracy has a very specific meaning. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea defines it as violent acts committed for private ends on the high seas, typically by non-state actors, classic criminals, not uniformed personnel flying a national flag. By that strict definition, confrontations involving state-affiliated forces usually fall outside the legal box labeled piracy.
That is where the complexity and the intent comes in. When Chinese Coast Guard or maritime personnel act under state authority, their actions are normally classified as law enforcement activity, however aggressive or disputed. Legally speaking, that makes the Philippines' piracy label difficult to sustain in a courtroom sense. But Manila was not arguing a case before judges. It was speaking to an audience far larger than any tribunal. In practice, the term piracy functions less as a legal charge and more as a strategic signal. It strips away technical language and reframes the incident in moral terms that are immediately understood. Violence at sea, seizure of property, injury to sailors. It challenges the idea that such behavior can be dismissed as routine patrols or administrative enforcement. In one word, the Philippines recast coercion as criminality. The objective is clear. By using language that resonates beyond bilateral diplomacy, Manila seeks to internationalize the incident, to push it out of the narrow frame of a Philippines-China dispute and into the broader conversation about maritime norms, freedom of navigation, and acceptable conduct at sea. Whether or not piracy holds up legally, it succeeds rhetorically by forcing the world to ask a sharper question. When does enforcement stop looking like law and start looking like force? China rarely leads with gray hulls and naval guns. Instead, it sends white ships. The primary instruments of pressure in contested waters are not the Navy, but the China Coast Guard and a vast network of maritime militia. Vessels that look civilian, behave aggressively, and operate in the space between peace and war. This is not accidental, it is design. The tactics are now well established. Chinese vessels block approaches, shadow targets at close range, board foreign boats, interfere with equipment, and maintain a constant presence that wears opponents down over time. These encounters are calibrated to stay just below the threshold that would justify a military response, while still imposing real physical and psychological pressure on crews at sea. No missiles, no declarations, just relentless friction. This approach is backed by scale. The China Coast Guard operates the largest Coast Guard fleet in the world, including multiple megacutters exceeding 10,000 tons, larger than many countries' frigates. Their size is not just symbolic. It allows Chinese ships to intimidate smaller vessels simply by proximity, to absorb collisions, and to dominate contested spaces without ever firing a shot. Presence becomes power.
For years, Manila tried quiet diplomacy. It avoided cameras, softened language, and handled incidents through back channels. That approach has now clearly changed. The Philippines has embraced transparency as a tool of defense, publicly releasing incident footage, photographs, and detailed briefings after confrontations at sea.